Jennifer felt an unusual chill in the air as she waited on the front porch, counting the minutes until her father Andrew and her mother, Mrs. Andrew, returned from their store downtown. She was only 10, but she already understood that life could be complicated. Her parents owned a modest market store that provided them with enough income to pay for her school fees and keep food on the table, but it demanded almost every bit of their time. On most afternoons, Jennifer's school bus dropped her at the front gate right after class, leaving her alone in an empty house until her mother arrived just before dinner. She tried to keep herself occupied with homework or by flipping through her storybooks, but a hollow feeling always crept in. In that silence, she would glance at the clock, wishing with all her heart that her parents could be around more often. Sometimes, a neighbor would pass by and wave, but nobody truly stayed to chat. Jennifer would think of the playground near her school, filled with laughter and friendly faces, and she longed to share stories with her mother or simply talk about her day. Every second stretched, and the quiet house felt like it was swallowing her. Yet she reminded herself of her parents' sacrifice and tried to stay strong, convinced that her lonely afternoons were just part of growing up. One evening, after waiting for what felt like an eternity, Jennifer heard the familiar sound of her parents unlocking the door. She ran to greet them, her eyes reflecting both relief and frustration. Her father, Andrew, placed a hand on her shoulder. "I know it's tough being alone," he said softly, looking into her eyes. "We hate leaving you by yourself, but our shop demands so many hours." Jennifer nodded, trying to be brave. She understood they needed to earn money for her education, but the ache in her chest remained. Her mother, Mrs. Andrew, tried to comfort her with promises that things would improve soon. Yet the days went on, and the lonely afternoons persisted. Eventually, Andrew announced a new plan. "Jennifer," he said with a small smile, "our neighbor, Maxwell, offered to keep you company until we get back. He's your uncle in a sense, always looking out for everyone on this street. Maybe this will help." Jennifer immediately thought of Maxwell's kind gestures. He often helped fix broken fences or carried groceries for neighbors, and felt a small glimmer of hope. Perhaps having someone around would make those afternoons less lonely. Her mother gave her a reassuring nod. Together, they decided this arrangement might be the answer they all needed. Not long after that conversation, Jennifer began heading to Maxwell's small house right after school. The place was just a short walk down the street, painted a dull blue that stood out among the rows of pale houses. Every day, Maxwell greeted her at the door with a wide grin. He was in his late 30s, a tall man with an easygoing manner that seemed to calm people. He'd say things like, "Welcome, my little friend," or "Come on in, kiddo," and offer her snacks. At first, Jennifer found it comforting to see his friendly face. He seemed to have a knack for knowing exactly when she felt nervous or shy. She would sit at the kitchen table, nibbling on cookies and sipping juice, listening to his stories about the time he volunteered at a charity or helped an elderly neighbor with errands. The warmth of his voice made her feel safe in those initial days. He even surprised her one afternoon with a small box wrapped in bright paper. Inside was a brand new drawing set, complete with markers and colored pencils. "Just for you," he said, winking. Jennifer felt special, and for the first time in a while, she forgot how lonely she had been before. In her mind, Maxwell became the fun uncle who always had a joke or a comforting story to share. After a few weeks, Jennifer's routine felt almost normal. She'd arrive at Maxwell's, share snacks, do her homework, and watch television while he handled small chores. But one afternoon, a shadow of unease crept into her mind. Maxwell suggested a secret game, something he insisted only the two of them could play. He had a grin on his face, but there was a new tension in his eyes that made Jennifer's stomach twist. She wasn't sure why she felt that way, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary game. At first, she tried to brush off her hesitation. Maxwell had been so generous and kind, why would he do anything to hurt her? Still, alarm bells were ringing somewhere deep inside. When he began explaining the rules, Jennifer felt a wave of discomfort wash over her. She wanted to say no, but her voice caught in her throat. He reached out and patted her shoulder in a way that didn't feel right. His usual smile had faded, replaced by something she couldn't quite identify. Unable to process the uneasy feeling, she nodded numbly. The so-called game began, but it was nothing like any game she had ever known. She felt her heart race, her cheeks flush, and a growing dread that wouldn't let her rest. That evening, she went to bed with a knot in her stomach, and a few hours later, she woke to find her sheets damp. It happened again the next night, and the night after. Mortified, Jennifer blamed herself, certain that she was doing something wrong, yet she couldn't name what that was. Jennifer struggled to concentrate in school. She had always been a bright student who took pride in raising her hand to answer questions, but these days she kept her head down. Her once bubbly laughter was replaced by a tense silence. Observing this change was her class teacher, Mrs. Jane, a soft-spoken woman who had taught at the school for many years. One morning, Mrs. Jane noticed Jennifer rubbing her eyes, looking as if she hadn't slept. Concern filled her face. She approached Jennifer gently after class. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked. Jennifer forced a smile and mumbled something about feeling tired, but Mrs. Jane saw the anxiety lurking behind her eyes. The teacher decided to keep a closer watch, suspecting that something deeper was amiss. As days passed, the dark circles under Jennifer's eyes grew more obvious, and her interactions with classmates dwindled. At home, her parents sensed her shift in mood but assumed she was stressed about exams. Andrew asked if she needed extra tutoring, while Mrs. Andrew wondered if she had been bullied at school. Jennifer said she was fine, though her voice trembled. In truth, she feared that if she spoke up, Maxwell's warnings would come true. He had told her to never mention the secret game to anyone, hinting that terrible things might happen if she did. Terrified of making matters worse, she remained silent, hoping her nightmares would disappear on their own. One afternoon, Mrs. Jane saw Jennifer huddled alone during break. Her classmates ran around playing games, but Jennifer looked lost in thought. Mrs. Jane walked over and softly placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "You can talk to me," she said, her voice steady. Jennifer's eyes welled up, but she hesitated. She remembered Maxwell's threat. Still, the concern in Mrs. Jane's gaze felt genuine, and something inside Jennifer snapped. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered, "I'm so scared." Mrs. Jane led her to a quiet corner of the staff room, offering tissues and a comforting hug. Bit by bit, the story spilled out. Jennifer didn't detail everything, but she mentioned how Maxwell had started a strange game that made her feel awful. She couldn't control her tears, shaking as she finally admitted that she felt trapped. Mrs. Jane listened without interruption, then pulled Jennifer close. "You're not alone," she said. Mrs. Jane promised to help her, no matter what. With Jennifer's permission, she reached out to the school counselor and the principal. The decision was made to contact Jennifer's parents immediately. That same day, Andrew and Mrs. Andrew arrived, alarm etched across their faces. Their daughter's tear-streaked cheeks and trembling hands told them this was not a minor issue. Through choked sobs, Jennifer managed to say enough for them to piece together the truth. Her parents were horrified. They had trusted Maxwell completely, never suspecting he could misuse that trust. Andrew wrapped his arms around Jennifer, while her mother wept, apologizing for not recognizing the signs sooner. In a matter of hours, the authorities were informed. A local officer who specialized in child protection visited the school to speak with Jennifer. Though her hands shook and her voice quivered, she felt a flicker of courage she hadn't had before. Confiding in Mrs. Jane had lifted a burden off her shoulders. The officer was calm and reassuring, explaining that Jennifer had done nothing wrong and that no one deserved to feel unsafe. Step by step, she recounted how Maxwell had changed from a friendly uncle figure into someone who pushed her into that secret game. Tears threatened to spill again, but she pressed on, determined to tell the full story so no other child would go through the same ordeal. After carefully documenting every detail, the officer promised a thorough investigation. Jennifer's parents stood by, their faces pale, but a sense of determination flickered in their eyes. That evening, the police arrived at Maxwell's home with a warrant. Neighbors watched from their windows as the officers knocked on his door. Jennifer trembled at the thought of him being nearby, but her parents assured her she would never have to go there again. Soon, the authorities led Maxwell out, hands cuffed, while he maintained a quiet, sullen expression. Rumors spread through the neighborhood, yet the details remained largely private to protect Jennifer. For her part, she felt a mix of fear and relief, uncertain about how life would unfold next. In the following weeks, Jennifer's parents took every step they could to support her. They sought professional counseling to help her cope with the emotional scars left by Maxwell's actions. At first, Jennifer was reluctant to speak with the counselor, a kind woman named Dr. Foster, but gradually, she opened up. Each session peeled back a layer of fear and confusion. Dr. Foster guided Jennifer to understand that what had happened was not her fault and that she was not alone in her struggle. Sometimes, Jennifer would cry, her voice shaking as she revisited those memories. Other times, she found a strange comfort in expressing her anger at Maxwell for betraying her trust. Her parents sat by her side, realizing how vital their presence was. Andrew rearranged his work schedule, ensuring that Jennifer was never left by herself after school. Mrs. Andrew also cut back her hours, determined to create a safer, more attentive environment at home. Although the process was slow, Jennifer could feel a small measure of hope returning to her life. Mornings felt lighter, and she no longer woke up shaking in the middle of the night. While the fear had not vanished entirely, she sensed that each day brought her closer to reclaiming her sense of security. Her parents encouraged her interest, reminding her of the joys she once found in art and reading. Little by little, she began to believe that, with time, healing was possible. Months later, Jennifer stood in front of her school's notice board, reflecting on how far she had come. She could still recall the terror she once felt, but she truly recognized her own strength. Her parents, attentive, reminded her daily that her voice mattered. When she spotted Mrs. Jane across the hallway, she waved, grateful for the teacher's compassion. Though the memories lingered, Jennifer knew she was no longer defined by fear. She had found courage, and that changed everything.